This is a story that challenges what you believe about justice, about faith, and about the limits of hope. The prison sounds were the kind that settle into you. Metal doors slammed like verdicts. Midnight screams threaded down concrete halls. The cruel taunts of inmates, men hardened by their own losses, ricocheted off cinder block until you learned to make them background noise. Marian Carter had lived with those sounds for 7 years, but nothing she had heard before matched the suffocating silence that comes when a final official decision lands. And yet, at dusk, when the concrete turned the dull color of old paper and the heat leaned against the yard, a guard walked past her cell and said, "You have a visitor." That line should have been ordinary. It was not. For the first 2 years after the arrest, Jalen had come nearly every week, a small boy with clenched hands, the kind of fierce loyalty that refuses to let a mother be anonymous. Then life pulled him away, an aunt who moved, a school that started new routines, the slow shame of being the child of someone in the news. He drove by sometimes, slowed at the gate, and then drove on. In the last 3 years, he had not come in at all, which was why, after 7 years, the word visitor landed like a small, impossible thing. Earlier that morning, before the heat had fully built, Marian's attorney had come with thin papers and worn shoes. He found her sitting on the narrow bunk, rosary in her hand. He sat across from her at the small table in the visiting room, folded his hands, and said what he had rehearsed in 100 quieter ways. The final appeal was denied. He waited, his apology thin as the folder he held. "I'm sorry, Marian. I did everything I could." Those words were not comfort. They were a record. For years, the lawyer's presence had been a ritual, forms filed, hearings requested, nights spent drafting motions that might unstick the state's machine. Today, his ritual had reached its end. Later, the intercom crackled with the warden's voice, flat, procedural. "Carter, Marian, prepare for transfer protocols. 14 days. 14 days. The number fell into the cell like cold water. It was not a sentence so much as a timetable, 2 weeks counted down in small mechanical steps. Marian felt the room pull tight around her, felt the world simplify to a few basic necessities. Breath, the rosary in her palm, the slow economy of keeping steady. Her fingers betrayed her with a small tremor. She wrapped the rosary tighter, tasting leather and the faint metal of the crucifix. That tiny motion, bead to thumb, was an old habit turned into armor. She did not let herself think in words. Numbers were dangerous. Names were dangerous. So she counted beads the way people count time when they are trying to stay alive. Life in the unit continued its harsh business. A woman down the row laughed a little too loud at something mean. A guard passed without looking. Later, one of the younger guards paused near her door and dropped his voice, as if he were offering something like charity. She didn't cry. Not once. It was not that Marian had run out of tears. She had spent the earlier years of the fight spending them where no one would see. The private currency of a person trying to keep together a life that had been unstitched. The calm the guard observed was not absence so much as an effort, the practice of staying small so the day would not swallow you whole. When she walked to the glass visiting booth that evening, she kept her steps steady because steadiness had become necessary work. The visiting room smelled of bleach and the faint echo of canned coffee. He was there, taller, broader. his face cut with the new angles of a young man who had learned to hold his feelings inside like a secret. Jalen rested his palm against the glass. Around his fingers, the rosary chain looped once, as if it were something he had been carrying in his pocket all this time. "I came," he said. Two words that carried everything. Regret, the awkwardness of grown children, the strange love that never learned good speeches. There was a trace of Magnolia in the air, a soft memory more than a scent, and Marian felt unexpectedly jarred by it, a warmth that felt like memory. They had 5 minutes. The guard's watch glinted. Routine hovered between them. Jalen pressed the rosary to the glass. Marian placed her hand opposite his, palms not meeting, but the contact of intention passing through the barrier. When the bell cut the visit short and the guard signaled the end, Marian turned back to the corridor. The door clanged shut behind her. The cell swallowed the sound, but the thought had already settled. 48 hours was not an abstraction. It had edges. It had a clock. How did it come to this? To answer that question, you have to go back 7 years. For years, Marian's work ran on small mercies. St. Augustine's clinic was a narrow room off the parish lot, fluorescent and practical, where people brought the worn parts of their lives, missed pills, bad coughs, arguments about home care. Marian knew them by name. She knew who needed a phone call and who needed someone to sit with them while the hospital forms were explained. Her desk drawer held a rosary whose beads were dark with touch. She thumbed them without thinking between patients. One late summer morning, Mr. Gerald Harlan came in, a retired mechanic with creased hands and a laugh that made people relax. Marian checked his chart. Allergies, current meds, recent changes. Her fingers moved with the kind of muscle memory built from thousands of small acts. When she typed his prescription number, the digits wavered for a fraction of a second, blurred as if seen in rain. She blinked, rubbed her temple, and retyped them. Fatigue did not wear a sign. It lived in those little hesitations. The clinic smelled of coffee and antiseptic, and from the window the magnolia trees let a faint, warm scent move through the room. The parish's Black Catholic life threaded through the place. A chipped statue of the Virgin sat between pamphlets. Someone had tucked a prayer card into the patient binder. Marian's faith showed in gestures, touching a shoulder, tucking a rosary into a folder before handing it to a worried daughter. She steadied people by how she moved. Linda Porter managed the clinic like a woman organizing a fragile ledger. Crisp jacket, clipped speech, eyes that cataloged risk. "We can't afford sloppy charts," she said once at a staff meeting. "Grant reviews are next month." Her voice never rose. It simply set the temperature of the room. Marian and Linda had a working truce. Marian's patient-first instincts, Linda's administrative hard edges. The truce bent when money and reputation were near. That day, the list was long. A flu surge had stretched volunteers thin, the waiting room filled with coughing people and small panics. Marian ran through intake for Mr. Harlan, circled a follow-up time, and briefed the nurse coming on duty. "Watch his INR overnight," she told the nurse, naming the blood test that monitors Coumadin levels, the anticoagulant he was on. "If it spikes, he could bleed. Check any unusual bruising or nosebleeds. Call me for anything." Coumadin was a tidy phrase until it wasn't. An anticoagulant can stop a clot, and if levels are off, it can make a small cut into something dangerous. Marian said the words because she had seen it before. She said them quietly, because the phrase carried weight. The touchscreen triage terminal had been acting odd all week. Marian had noticed it in fits and starts, menus that skipped, fields that flashed back. She'd meant to put in a ticket, but tickets melted into the day. Today, as she logged Mr. Harlan's meds, the screen stuttered once and the time field blinked. Marian frowned. She tapped the field, watched the timestamp reset before her eyes, and felt a small prickle at the base of her skull. She made a mental note to mention it. Small clinics accept small faults. Today, she let it slide. Night fell and the clinic shifted. The night nurse walked in. The handoff was routine. Marian initialed the chart where required, scanning the pages with a practiced decisiveness. Her pen hovered at the bottom line, the one updating the medication schedule. For a breath, she hesitated, an almost imperceptible pause, then signed. The pen left a dark, decisive line that dried quickly in the hospital light. That night, the small mistakes lined up like a row of falling dominoes. Marian had left the clinic at dusk, believing the handoff tidy. She had not seen the subtle work that rearranged a life. Someone opened the medication cabinet and slid a vial just enough to change the label's angle. The cap clicked the same. The slot was the same. A casual glance would say nothing was wrong. A careful hand, one with hours to spare, might have felt the sticker tuck under. The switch was slight, the sort of thing that hid in a busy room. At 2 in the morning, the touchscreen hiccuped. The nurse on duty cursed as the timestamp blinked and jumped backward. The camera over the med cabinet blinked black for a few seconds and returned out of sync. When the feed came back, motion didn't match the clock. A 7-minute gap had opened like a seam in the audit trail. On paper, the chart looked clean. Initials where initials should be, times filled in. But under the forensic eye, the timeline stuttered. Ink showed where someone had written over a number. The audit trail showed a small vacancy. The difference between tidy and tampered was microscopic and, for prosecutors, telling. 2 mornings later, Mr. Harlan collapsed at home. His daughter Elise filmed the ambulance's arrival with a shaking hand and posted a 30-second clip with the caption, "They killed my papa." The clip looped on local feeds. It carried his daughter's raw voice, "Why did this happen?" and a shot of the clinic's discharge note pinned to the caption. Someone in the comments had circled the timestamp with a red marker and typed, "Look at this." The clip fed the kind of outrage that travels faster than nuance. The clinic felt the pressure acute and immediate. Volunteers called in sick. Linda Porter moved through the back office like a woman trying to close a dam. Stern, precise, urgent. "We need a statement," she told the receptionist, but her voice carried something like a calculation. Protect the clinic, preserve the grant, limit exposure. In the cramped staff room, a manager whispered, "Get us legal. Fast." The word reputation was spoken as if it were brittle and could crack under public gaze. County prosecutors do not level capital charges on anger. They build a scaffold of evidence and then attach a narrative. The combination of an elderly, fragile patient, inconsistent medical records, and a public outcry formed a scaffold prosecutors could use. They pulled the cabinet log, the audit trail, the lab results. They interviewed staff. They scanned phone records. They searched for the hands that had touched the chart. When the prosecutor announced charges, the language tightened. Alleged intentional tampering and capital murder came across the microphones with a formal weight. In the press room, the prosecutor said, We allege a degree of misconduct inconsistent with clerical error. An elderly anticoagulated patient's treatment was altered, allegedly, with consequences. The phrase, depraved indifference, dropped into the room like a hammer. Marian listened to recordings of her own entries with detectives, watching the audit trail frame time in little ticks and blanks. She said what she had always said. She had initialed the page, briefed the night nurse, and warned about Coumadin, an anticoagulant that can turn a small bleed into something deadly if levels swing. She felt small in the big, flat light of that room where truth was checked like stock. At the clinic, people argued quietly. Linda's face folded into something specific, not blind fear, but the sharp panic of someone who saw the ledger of consequences. She feared losing the clinic's funding and the ripple that would drown staff and patients. She calculated which narratives to lean on and which names to protect. When Marian met her eye in the hallway, Linda's look was fractioned, part alarm, part rapid assessment. Which statements to release? Which files to bury? It was the look of someone deciding whether damage control would require a scapegoat. The detectives moved with routine. They asked questions that sounded procedural and then slid, with the momentum of the case, into confrontation. The audit trail showed that 7-minute blank. The cabinet log had a slot of time where a label had been moved. A lab result that should have required immediate review was logged as reviewed later. Patterns began to look like a path. Arrest has a sensory rhythm, the cold of metal, the soft rustle of paper, the sudden noise of keys. For Marian, the moment came with an ordinary, absurd detail. The handcuffs smelled faintly of the same detergent the guards used on their uniforms, clean and antiseptic. The smell, a domestic cleanliness, made the reality of the cuffs feel unreal, like a stage prop. Her wrists clicked shut. The sound was bright and final in the small room. Outside, the clinic's front door had a pale smudge of magnolia pollen where a petal had landed that morning. Inside, the single overwritten number on Mr. Harlan's chart stared up like an accusation. The pen she had signed with the previous night, its ink dried, decisive, was suddenly the most damning mark anyone could point to. They led her down the corridor with careful words. "You are under arrest for—" The phrasing felt antiseptic and wildly disproportionate. People watched from behind glass. A volunteer covered her face. The receptionist pressed her lips together so tight small lines showed at the edge. Linda followed the exit at a measured distance, lips pressed, hands folded over her phone as if holding a script. When their eyes met again, Linda's expression had sharpened into a work plan. Statements to issue, files to secure, donors to call. Beneath it, there was the private fear. If we fail public confidence, this clinic may not survive. It was practical terror wearing the mask of calculation. Marian's mind cataloged details because cataloging had been her trade. Dates, doses, calls. Now, the details piled like stones. The detective read the charges. The handcuffs bit the skin. The metal was ordinary and unarguable. The cameras were already outside the clinic by dusk, lights small and predatory. The community's outrage was a chorus. A single line on a chart had shifted her fate. When the courtroom slammed its door closed for the last time, Marian's life folded into a calendar. Appeals arrived and were returned. Jalen was 12 the day it all began. In the first months, he came like a boy with a mission. 2 big sneakers, a backpack, hands that wanted to do something useful. He filled his pockets with small offerings, a crooked drawing, a sandwich, the rosary. He would press his palm to the glass, eyes fierce, and leave with a quiet hug. Over time, those small offerings lessened. Life pulled him away. Visits shrank from weekly to monthly to the occasional drive-by where he slowed at the gate and then drove on. She never demanded an explanation. She folded her days around the spaces he left. Those early years remained vivid in a few sharp images rather than a timeline. A folded homework page with crayons still on the corner, a rosary bead tucked into a threadbare pocket. A 12-year-old jaw clenched so hard his knuckles whitened when the visiting door closed. In year 4, his Aunt Rose became a quieter fixture. A woman of plain, steady faith, she sometimes drove Jalen to the gate, offering a presence that didn't ask for explanations. Once, Marian saw her from the window, smoothing his collar without words. Her presence said, family, still held a line. The last 3 years tightened into a new pattern. Jalen would come to the gate, park, and stand looking at the fence as if testing whether the metal would answer him. He would stand with his hand on the chain link, palm flat. On those days, Marian noticed the small rituals he kept, a folded napkin in his pocket, the way he'd read a message and then tuck his phone away. Then a whisper moved through the neighborhood, quiet and terrible in its intimacy. Rosa, the neighbor who ran a corner store, told Jalen one afternoon, "There's someone at the hospital who can't sleep. A nurse keeps saying she can't shake what she saw." For Jalen, it was a grain that tipped a scale. When the county clerk's notice arrived, final appeal denied, execution scheduled, time contracted in a different way. 14 days was not a long span for lawyers. For family, it was a narrowing corridor. Jalen read the message on the break at the warehouse, fingers white around his phone. He did not speak. He left the break room, climbed into his car, and drove with one purpose mounted in him. That evening, he returned with Aunt Rose. She sat in the corner of the visitor room, hands folded, lips thin with prayer. He walked to the glass with the measured heavy steps of a man who had been carrying his absence for years. He reached into his pocket and drew out the rosary, Marian's rosary, worn and familiar, and pressed it to the glass. He kept his palm flat against the barrier, the beads coiled into a small, blunt knot in his fist. He simply held the rosary there as if the metal and bead chain could bridge the distance that law and shame had widened. Marian placed her hand opposite his, not touching, but letting the barrier hold the contact between them. Marian watched the line of his jaw, the new shadow along his cheek, the way his shoulders carried the add-on gravity of a man who'd learned too young to carry everything. The whisper, Rosa's news, hung in the air like a note in an old song. It was one reason Jalen had come. Another reason was the simple arithmetic of shame running out of runway. He had been 12 when this started. He had returned at nearly 20 because the edges of responsibility had finally sharpened into action. They had minutes that felt both too short and expansive. Jalen's hand stayed on the glass when the guard announced the end of visiting time. He lingered. Marian watched him imprint a small, warm print onto the pane. When they were pulled apart, Jalen eased back toward Aunt Rose without words. Marian stood a heartbeat longer, touching the rosary she'd worn for years, as if making sure it was still real. Outside, the clock ticked. Inside, a new kind of counting had begun. The hand on the glass, Jalen's palm flattened where Marian could see it, a simple, solid punctuation to years of distance. They brought her paperwork after the visit. The intake sergeant moved with the slow efficiency of someone who moves between births and burials and thinks both are placid facts of life. He slid the sheet across the table. Final wishes? Last requests. Marian read the page. Her name, an address, dates, a line with a blank space for a last phone call or a family meal. Marian could have written nothing. She could have asked for something simple, something that fit neatly into the world that had been organized around her. Instead, she closed the clipboard and said quietly, 10 minutes in the chapel. That's all. The sergeant blinked. The clipboard caught the light. You understand the restrictions, he said, like a man reading from a familiar script. I do, Marian answered. Her voice had the flatness of someone who had learned to carry heavy things without fuss. 10 minutes. No more. He tapped his radio, called the warden, received the approval, and then looked at her with a flicker of softness that surprised her. 10, he said. They led her down a corridor that smelled of institutional cleaner and hot metal. The chapel door looked smaller than she had imagined, made of heavy wood and scuffed paint. For a moment, she thought of other doors she had crossed. Hospital rooms, small funeral parlors, a lawyer's office with too many files. Each had been a hinge. This one closed behind her with a hush. The little room held a different air. It was not a place for spectacle. The statue of the Virgin Mary sat on a shelf, hands folded, a small paper votive tucked at her feet. The light from the high windows cut the dust into thin bars. Marian knelt at the front pew with the deliberate slowness of a person measuring motion. Her palms found the rosary the way old habits find their routes. Fingers lift a bead, thumb draws it toward the next. Jalen's beads lay cool under her thumb. She did not invent a prayer. She did not arrange words into a tidy petition. Her voice came raw. If you are there, she whispered, give me something small, not to be saved, just not to be afraid. Her throat closed on the last syllable, so she made it a shape more than a sentence. The chapel answered with silence that was almost tactile, thick between the pews, pressing backwards against the noise of the prison. Light changed in a way she could not name. It was not sudden. It was not bright. It simply warmed, like a coat settling on shoulders that had worn thin. The warmth moved from the floor upward, a soft bloom across the wood grain where her hands rested. Marian felt it more than saw it, a small easing behind the breastbone, the kind of untying that comes when someone loosens a knot you could not reach. She thumbed the rosary again, each bead a small anchor. Her lips moved without much sound. The names she had known ran like a slow list through her head. She felt the shape of a lifetime in 3 motions. Bead, breath, bead. At the door, the guard on duty paused. He had been at the threshold for years and had learned that prisons were measured in rules and exceptions. He had not expected to notice anything more complicated than a damp patch or a loose tile. He inhaled and caught plainly the scent of Magnolia, soft and warm. It touched him like a memory and left him quiet. He stepped back into his patrol with his steps unchanged but his mouth tighter, as if he had been given a secret and had not decided what to do with it. Marian did not look at him. She kept her eyes lowered, watching the rosary move under her fingers. Her prayer did not climb to the ceiling. It folded around the smallness she had asked for. Courage to face an hour, a steadying breath, a hand that felt like someone holding the other side. The 10 minutes had a clock. It had a face and hands and the unbending reliability of measured time. Marian watched the second hand make its slow round while she counted nothing at all, only rhythm, only bead and breath. Each tick sounded louder in the hush. The minutes became a necklace, each one a small weight that she threaded past the next. A laugh slipped from her, short, raw, half grief and half relief. It surprised her. The sound folded into the pews and did not echo. It was small enough for no one to notice and true enough to feel like a confession. Near the last minute, she opened her mouth again, and this time the prayer was a single, sober line. Not to be afraid. She pressed the rosary to her lips as if sealing the words to the beads themselves. The light settled. The air tilted warm around her like a hand laid across a shoulder. She rose slowly. Her knees made a small crack. The chapel's hush held her as if in a small, private ceremony. The guard opened the heavy door and stepped aside. For a simple, human beat, their eyes met. No words passed. The guard's face kept a look that was no longer only professional. He gave her the small, restrained nod of someone who had seen a thing and could not say whether to report it or keep it close. Marian walked back into the corridor with 10 minutes folded into the inside of her chest. She had asked for small mercy. She had not asked for miracles. She had asked to not be afraid. The night waited beyond the door. Marian lay on the narrow bunk with Jalen's rosary coiled through her fingers, counting beads, bead, breath, bead. The night felt like a withheld thing, all edges. Around 2, the air changed, but with a warmth that moved along the corridor like a slow hand. Marian felt it first, as a loosening behind the ribs. The rosary warmed in her palm, her breath, which had been short and sharp for years, lengthened of its own accord. Then the scent arrived. Magnolia, full and thick. It pooled at the foot of her bunk and climbed, soft as a thread. She turned her head slowly. Nothing moved. No one passed. The vent hummed the same. The corridor remained the corridor. Yet the scent stayed, intimate and clear. Marian closed her eyes, searching for a practical source. The vent? No. A guard's aftershave? No footstep had passed. The scent did not belong to a person. It belonged to the space itself, as if the room had remembered a summer she had thought long gone. Her fingers tightened around the beads. The motion was automatic. Index, thumb, index. And with it came a small sound. A single, steady exhale. Tears gathered at the corners of her eyes and slid the way they do when grief is finally allowed a small exit. They were quiet tears, the private kind she had hoarded for nights when no one watched. She let them fall. Letting them felt like a confession. Down the row, a woman stirred, then paused. Voices that prowled through the block slowed into an attentive hush. A bunkmate shuffled to the door, nose up, as if listening for a sound, then stepped back and called softly down the hall. "You smell that? Magnolia?" The whisper threaded quickly, from cell to cell. A low current of people noticing, trading glances. A guard walking the other end of the tier halted and inhaled, brow tightening, then resumed his loop with a look that did not belong to routine. Inside the block, the rumor moved among the people who lived the night. Marian did not seek spectacle. She did not search for light or form. She felt the air cradle her, the way a hand might hold a shoulder, and for the first time in years, something loosened that she had assumed would stay knotted forever. Her shoulders dropped a degree. Her jaw unclenched. She breathed in and did not feel the habitual hitch that preceded doom. She spoke once, so soft the words might have been for herself. "Not to be brave," she said. just to be not afraid. The line sat between the bunks like an offering. No answer came in words. There was only a small shift in the night. More breathing, more stillness, as if the block had conferred permission for someone to rest. Sleep came then. Not the thin doze she'd learned in years of wakefulness, but a deeper, steadier rest. Her hand still held the rosary, thumb marking beads as if time itself should be held at the scale of touch. The world reduced itself to slow inhalations and the soft theater of breath. At first light, the ordinary noises resumed. Doors clanged, boots scuffed, a kettle hissed in the mess. The early guard paused outside her cell and inhaled, a quick, involuntary breath that stopped him for half a second. He looked past the bars, as if checking for a scent source, and then said, shortly, to the next guard, "Smells like Magnolia in there." His voice did not rise. It was factual and small, but it carried through the tear like a pebble dropping in still water. The other guard glanced up, nodded, and the two of them went on with the rounds. The observation, simple and unadorned, threaded into the block's morning. A woman across the way made a small sign of the cross. Another inmate smoothed her hair with slow fingers. A bunkmate nodded when Marian walked past the doorway. No fanfare, only quiet acknowledgement. Marian woke with a feeling that the night had left something behind. The rosary in her hand was warmer than when she'd gone to bed. She ran a thumb across the small crucifix and felt its metal edge. The cell looked the same, pale cinder block, the same narrow bunk. But her perception had shifted the way the world does after a small, private reprieve. Outside the bars, the corridor smelled clean and institutional again. But when the guard at the door stepped in, he paused and met her eyes. He did not ask for a report or for an explanation. He only said softly, "Why does it smell like Magnolia in here?" Marian looked at him. She had a dozen ready responses. Ventilation, someone outside, nothing at all. Instead, she let a small, almost private smile lift the corner of her mouth. It was a smile that did not belong to victory or relief, but to the kind of knowledge you tuck into your pocket, because you are not yet ready to give it away. The guard's face shifted a fraction. The moment was brief and contained. Then he stepped back and closed the door with a quiet click. By mid-morning, the story in the block was taut and specific. At roughly 2 in the morning, several people had smelled Magnolia. One woman had been found kneeling in the chapel before dawn. A dozen inmates described a warmth that had settled in the air like a blanket. That afternoon, as the staff went through routine business, an anonymous message arrived in the investigator's inbox. "I have something to say." The subject line carried no flourish. It landed like an unadorned fact, a beginning rather than an explanation. Marian held the rosary that night and found that her thumb moved differently over the beads, slower. The air outside the cell was the same institutional gray. Inside the smallness of her chest, something had shifted. 2 hours. The control room moved like clockwork. Monitors blinked, forms were checked, the warden's headset sat in its familiar place. Warden Miller answered the single line that rings only when something comes from above. On the other end, a voice confirmed the impossible. A temporary stay. The words hit like a thrown stone. The warden's fingers tightened on the receiver. Around him, people slowed, glances met. A careful silence dropped over the room. "Repeat that," he said. The voice on the line was calm and unequivocal. "The governor's office has ordered a stay pending new evidence. "Stop all protocols," Miller told his deputy, voice clipped. "Hold the clock." 24 hours earlier, an anonymous email had landed in an investigator's inbox. "I have something to say." The meeting place was a diner off the highway, neutral and small. Teresa Bell arrived with the plain gait of someone who worked nights and kept to routines. She carried a manila envelope and a plastic bag. Her hands trembled when she put them on the table. Inside the envelope were papers, original cabinet logs printed from the clinic's server, timestamps in a neat column. Inside the bag, a small vial wrapped in sterile gauze, untouched. Teresa slid a thumb drive across with the same careful motion. "I can't keep this," she said, voice low. "It started as tidying. Linda said audits hit donors if things looked messy. She told us to fix timestamps so records read clean. It snowballed." She did not dramatize. She showed. Her fingers fumbled the vial as if the weight of holding it in public was heavier than any pry. She tapped a printed log where an entry had been changed, an over-inked number that devoured the original digit. On the drive, a clipped segment played. Two voices, one an administrator saying, "We need to manage perception." The other answering with something like a laugh and later, "Keep donors calm." The tone made intent audible. Teresa's affidavit was a series of practical sentences. Who, when, what she'd done, and what she'd been asked to do. Her pen hand shook when she signed. She folded the papers with the same slow, careful motion she'd used on shift when setting out trays and checking doses. Outside, on the windshield of her car, a single magnolia petal lay flat, pale against the glass, absurd and fragile. She brushed it away with the heel of her hand and drove to the station. The prosecutor moved fast. Originals change a case from rumor to evidence, a vial, a log, an internal recording. Together they made an outline prosecutors could fill in. An emergency petition was drafted and routed to the governor's office with the speed reserved for things that might prevent irreversible harm. The judge, reading the file, tapped a stamp and signed a stay pending reinvestigation. That phrase, temporary stay, arrived for Marian like air finding a small cracked window. Her attorney, called into the visiting area, held the phone as if it might be fragile. "They found something," he told her simply. Marian closed her fingers around the rosary Jalen had pressed into her hand. The beads were warm from the afternoon light. She did not sob or shout. She folded the news into herself with the care of someone who had learned to hold hope small and private. Outside the booth, Jalen sat stiff. Aunt Rose by his side kept her hands clasped. The lawyer's words loosened a line in Jalen's jaw. He did not make a show of relief. He leaned forward and pressed his forehead for a second against his knuckles, eyes closed, the motion small and exact. Word moved faster than paperwork. People who had watched from porches now clustered at the church steps. A few faces from the clinic appeared in a near-silent knot near the fellowship hall door. At the clinic, Linda Porter's office door stayed closed. Staff exchanged looks that tried on relief and found fear underneath it. If Teresa was right, standard operating procedure read like a cover story. Detectives issued subpoenas. Clerks printed copies. The county machine retooled its gears. For the first time in 7 years, evidence existed that suggested coordinated alteration rather than an isolated error. It did not erase the months Marian had spent in a cell or the way community anger had gathered like a storm. It did open a new channel, a legal hinge through which the truth might travel. Teresa went home with the relief of a thing unburdened and the small shock of exposure. She kept thinking of the magnolia petal on her windshield, how absurd a symbol it had seemed, and how small witnesses sometimes land on the most stubborn surfaces. Inboxes that afternoon began to show other anonymous tips. A name, a shift, a timestamp. 2 people remembered changing. The chain that Teresa began was not a single confession, but an invitation. At dusk, a small group gathered outside St. Augustine's. Neighbors with casseroles, parishioners with folded hands, clinic volunteers with tired faces. They did not know the outcome. They knew only this: the machine that had been grinding toward an end had stopped, if only for now. They stood under magnolia shadows and watched windows glow. Back at the penitentiary, Warden Miller walked the control room with a folder in hand and an expression that had shifted from shock to the flattened concentration of a man dealing with new orders. Cameras waited, motionless. Marian sat in her cell with the rosary in her lap and the news folded into her like a cautious promise. The stay was temporary. The work ahead was not. But for the first time in 7 years, there was a crack in the wall she had been living against. A crack wide enough for a small, hard light to get in. The stay changed the neighborhood's rhythm. Word moved fast, from church pews to porches, from the barber's chair to the corner store. By afternoon, a small procession gathered at the prison gate. People with casseroles, a hand-woven wreath of magnolia leaves, quiet faces that had watched Marian's story on the news and decided it would not end as a headline. They stood a respectful distance from the fence, a sign reading, "We stand with Marian Carter," propped against the rail. The magnolia wreath smelled faint and honest in the heat, the green stubborn against the iron bars. It was a public thing, neighbors translating private care into one solid, visible act. Inside the visiting room, Jalen did what words couldn't. He crossed the floor and pressed both palms flat to the glass. Marian mirrored him, palms opposite palms. He dropped the rosary into her hand, his fingers lingering as if to transfer not just beads, but an apology that had no better shape. "I'm sorry I left," he said, voice low and exact. Marian held the beads a moment before she answered. She did not issue forgiveness as a gift or a spectacle. She touched his hand against the glass, then tucked the rosary against her heart. "I know," she said. The exchange was small and real, enough to begin the work of repair. Outside, the parish responded quickly. The church council met with clinic leaders and drafted a practical plan. A community oversight committee, volunteer monitors for high-risk medication handling, and funding for an independent audit. It was not dramatic policy, only the modest scaffolding neighbors could hold. And that was the point. The press, whose tone had been sharp and accusatory, shifted to questions of reform. Reporters asked what would prevent this from happening again. Volunteers talked about logs and checks. A neighbor named Rosa stepped forward with a small, deliberate gesture. She handed Marian a tiny paper envelope. "I kept this," she said, her voice steady. "I found the bead by your porch the week you were taken. I thought you might want it back one day." Inside was a single rosary bead, worn smooth by touch. Marian turned it between her fingers. The bead fit into the chain the way a missing note returns a hymn to whole. At the clinic, Linda Porter's office door stayed closed. Staff traded looks that tried on relief and found fear underneath. A slip of paper, an unsigned apology, arrived at the parish. Words that did not undo anything but nudged conversation toward accountability. Detectives issued subpoenas. Clerks printed copies. The machine of investigation hummed back into motion, now fed by witness and evidence. Neighbors pitched in practical ways. Casseroles left on porches, someone mowing the thin lawn at Marian's old address, others volunteering to sit with patients while audits ran. A small magnolia sapling was planted by a neighbor at the curb nearest Marian's house, the kind of symbolic, stubborn thing a community plants to mark witness and work. As dusk fell, Marian packed a small bag under her lawyer's careful direction. She folded clothes, simple, clean, and slipped the returned bead into a pocket. Jalen stood near the door with Aunt Rose. He moved, with the slow, deliberate gait of someone testing limbs after a long illness. When Marian stepped toward the gate, he hesitated and then did something he had not done in years. He laid his palm flat on the outside of the metal and let it rest there as she walked through. Their hands did not meet. The metal divided them still. But for both, the touch, skin to cold steel, was an act. A vow made in public, small and awkward and true. Marian felt the press of his palm through the glass of memory, an imprint she could carry even when the gate closed behind her. They left under a dimming sky. People dispersed in pairs and small knots. Plans murmured for committee meetings and audits. The tone was not triumphant. It was the slow, steady business of neighbors deciding to stay. Yet under that calm sat a new awareness. This was not the end. The legal work would unfold. Subpoenas would call names, and the clinic's routines would be examined in public. The magnolia sapling by the curb caught the last light, leaves shining like small props in an uncertain play. Marian stepped into a car with Jalen beside her and Aunt Rose in the front seat. As they pulled away, the sapling stayed in the frame of the rearview mirror, young and newly planted, a marker of witness and of the work left to do. It was a hopeful image, but not a promise. The road ahead had a long bend. Marian's house looked smaller than the photographs in her file, paint peeling at the porch, weeds in the strip of soil. Jalen fetched rollers and a can of pale blue paint. He worked with long, efficient strokes. Marian sanded and filled cracks. When paint splattered on his shoe, she laughed, sharp and surprised. That evening, they planted a magnolia sapling in the front strip. Jalen set the young trunk straight while Marian pressed soil around the roots. He kept the rosary in his pocket, and while tamping the earth, thumbed the beads slowly. When Marian asked about a neighbor's name, he answered in fragments. The rosary marks stitched the pauses into meaning. Back at the clinic, the welcome was careful, not effusive. Some staff avoided her gaze. Others offered a brief, awkward hug. Marian started with small tasks, audit sheets, double-checking logs. An older woman in the waiting room reached for her hand and cried, the embrace that followed both honest and embarrassed. Marian let it be, letting touch show what words could not. The Oversight Committee met weekly, and Marian agreed to speak, not as a celebrity, but as someone who'd lived the damage. She revised her talk to be lean and practical. 3 concrete proposals for accountability. She wrote the points in bold, then practiced aloud once in the kitchen while Jalen put dishes away. Her return to the clinic carried moments of sharp awareness. A whispered comment about donors, a manager's carefully chosen words. Marian learned the microeconomy of trust, who avoided eye contact, who offered extra shifts. It was not sudden warmth. The anonymous envelope waited on her kitchen table one afternoon. It contained a single line. There are still people who need to speak. The paper's edges were soft from someone folding it and unfolding it again. The note landed with a light, specific weight. an invitation, and a warning. That night, Jalen reviewed her draft, his thumb marking beads on the rosary. He tapped a paragraph, suggesting a way to invite voices, not lecture them. "Will you make it safe? For them?" he asked softly. Marian nodded. The next evening, the parish hall was full. Marian stepped up, promising not miracles but a process, anonymous reporting, witness support, and independent review. She cut the talk to essentials, then opened the floor. A hand rose at the back. A woman's voice shook. "I don't feel safe saying this anywhere else." The sentence landed like a bell. Marian moved down the aisle to stand beside her as the woman spoke a name, a shift, a memory. She had no proof, only the courage to lay it down. Marian took notes with a steady hand. After, as neighbors clustered and signed up for observation slots, the anonymous note no longer felt like a threat. It felt like a call. Jalen walked her to the door and paused at the threshold. He put his palm briefly on the frame, the same gesture he'd used at the prison gate, then released it. Marian felt the warmth of that touch long after the moment itself. Outside, the Magnolia sapling leaned in the breeze, a young silhouette against the night. The road ahead would be long, the work slow. But that night, healing moved forward in small, stubborn steps. The parish hall filled with neighbors, parishioners, and volunteers who had watched the story unfold. Stained glass painted the floor. A hymn warmed the air. Marian stood at the lectern, her remarks pared down to practical steps. She spoke without rhetoric, thanking those who had kept vigil. Then she outlined the work ahead. Duplicate medication logs stored off-site, a volunteer rota to witness high-risk dosing, and an anonymous hotline. When she finished, the applause was quiet but steady. As Marian walked toward Jalen, they shared a wordless exchange. He touched the rosary in his pocket, then laid a hand on her shoulder. Marian closed her hand on his for a breath, the gesture saying what words could not. The advisory group gathered immediately after. They pinned the first reform list to the bulletin board and began assigning responsibilities for audits and volunteer schedules. Outside, magnolia petals drifted down the church steps. Marian felt them the way a person feels a memory, without having to name it. People clustered in small groups, leaning into pragmatic plans. A neighbor pinned a schedule for volunteer visits. Aunt Rose and others signed up to monitor a hotline. Reporters who once pushed furious headlines now asked about reforms. The tone had shifted to accountability. In the clinic, the first completed audit went up on the staff notice board. Detectives continued their work. Subpoenas moved in legal rhythms. The unsigned apology that had arrived to the parish was filed with the case materials, evidence now among other pieces mandating examination. The community's energy bent toward oversight and repair rather than spectacle. As dusk sank, volunteers planted the magnolia sapling at the curb by Marian's house. Someone wrapped a ribbon around its thin trunk. A child from the neighborhood patted the soil down with solemn care. The small tree looked like witness, green and stubborn against the ordinary street. Marian stood for a moment at the church steps with Jalen beside her. He took the rosary from his pocket and held it between them. Without speaking, he pressed the beads into her hand. She closed her fingers around them and then placed her palm lightly on his shoulder. The contact was a tether, quiet, steady, forward-looking. She said the mantra then, quietly, not as sermon, but as a shaping sentence for what must come next. When every door closes, the light still finds its way. The words sat between them and folded into the evening like a promise and a task. A woman lingered behind the crowd, someone Marian did not know, holding a rosary of her own. Their eyes met. The stranger inclined her head and retreated into the twilight. Marian did not call after her. Small acknowledgments like that travel in their own time. Justice in this story was not a headline, but small, sustained acts. The work would take time. Marian walked to the car with Jalen and Aunt Rose. The Magnolia sapling showed against the dark, a small spine of green. As they pulled away, the church light receded. Remember what followed. Prayer met process. Neighborliness turned to oversight. Faith braided with accountability. If this work matters, subscribe to JusticeSoul for more stories where light finds its way. Share this one to help turn witness into lasting change.